The house was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the wooden floors echoing through the empty rooms. The soft afternoon sunlight streamed through the half-closed curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. In his room, the protagonist stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt. The fabric felt cool against his skin as he tugged at the collar, making sure it fit just right. He wasn't used to being alone in the house this time of day. His wife had taken the kids out for a short errand, leaving him in peace. The stillness felt odd, almost suffocating. As he smoothed down his shirt, he found himself thinking about the quietness that seemed to grow between him and his stepson, Alex, lately. There had been something different about the boy, something he couldn't quite place. But today, that wasn't on his mind. Today, he focused on himself. He paused for a moment, admiring his reflection, before his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming down the hallway. At first, he assumed it was his wife returning early, but then he realized the steps were too light, too quick to be hers. His heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly who it was. The door creaked open without a knock, and there stood Alex. His eyes widened in surprise, and there was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Alex, usually so confident and composed, seemed momentarily lost for words. Without a word, he spun on his heels and hurried out of the room, closing the door behind him. His face was flushed, his steps hurried, but no words were exchanged. The protagonist stood still, staring at the door, his mind racing. The situation felt strange, too strange to ignore. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake the feeling of unease that crept over him. What had just happened? Was it an accident? Or was there more to it than that? He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was nothing more than a simple mistake. But something nagged at him, something he couldn't shake. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. But in the back of his mind, doubts began to form, slowly building into something he couldn't ignore. For the rest of the afternoon, the house seemed even quieter. The usual noise of everyday life, dishes clinking, doors opening and closing, was absent. It was as if the house itself had become aware of the unspoken tension that had just settled in. As the sun began to set, the protagonist found himself staring out the window, lost in thought, trying to piece together what had just happened. But the answers didn't come. Only more questions. And those questions would follow him for days to come. The following evening, the protagonist sat at the dinner table, watching Alex from across the room. It had been a quiet day, the kind that seemed to drag on without much purpose. Yet, the silence felt heavier now, charged with an unspoken tension that hung between them. Alex, normally full of energy and conversation, seemed distant, his gaze flickering nervously when it met the protagonist's. His posture, slumped and uneasy, told a story the protagonist wasn't ready to hear, but couldn't ignore. The usual routine continued as normal, the clinking of silverware, the scraping of plates, but it was all overshadowed by the discomfort in the air. The protagonist's eyes often drifted back to Alex, who was poking at his food, his mind clearly elsewhere. It wasn't like Alex to act this way. Normally, he was engaged in the conversation, always the one to start a story or joke around with his family. But tonight, he barely seemed to notice what was happening around him. A nagging suspicion lingered in the protagonist's mind. What had happened earlier? The way Alex had walked in without knocking, the strange look on his face when he realized the protagonist was in the middle of changing, it had all felt too odd to be a simple mistake. The protagonist's thoughts drifted back to the awkwardness of the moment. Why hadn't Alex apologized, or at least acknowledged the breach of privacy? Instead, he had just turned and hurried away, leaving behind nothing but the unsettling silence. As the meal went on, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Alex's avoidance only deepened the sense of unease. He kept his focus on his plate, avoiding eye contact whenever the protagonist looked his way. It was a subtle but telling sign. Something was wrong, and the protagonist couldn't help but wonder what it was. The more he watched Alex, the more it seemed like the boy was hiding something. It wasn't just the way he was acting tonight, it was the way he had been acting for weeks now. secretive, distracted, and far too distant. Something had shifted in their relationship, and the protagonist could sense it. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of strained politeness, with no one daring to address the elephant in the room. After dinner, the protagonist retreated to his study, hoping the quiet of the room would help him think. But as the night wore on, his mind continued to race, circling back to the same question: what had happened? In the dark of the study, as the house around him seemed to fall into a deep slumber, the protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by the soft hum of his phone. He picked it up absently, not expecting anything urgent. But as he glanced at the screen, his heart skipped a beat. There, on the screen, was an unfamiliar name, one he didn't recognize. It was a message, simple but loaded with implication. A small piece of the puzzle, but enough to make the protagonist's pulse quicken. He set the phone down, staring at it for a long moment, the weight of what he had just discovered sinking in. The house was quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different. The protagonist could feel the tension, the undercurrent of something sinister that had only just begun to surface. And as he sat there in the dark, the questions swirled around him, threatening to take over his every thought. The morning came quietly, the first light of day creeping in through the blinds. The protagonist woke early, his mind still heavy with the previous night's unsettling discoveries. The silence in the house felt suffocating, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His thoughts kept returning to the message he had seen on his phone, the name he didn't recognize, the implication of what it might mean. It was a small clue, but it was enough to drive him to action. After a quick shower, the protagonist dressed in his usual work clothes, though his mind was far from his tasks. He tried to focus on his day, but the weight of the situation lingered, pulling at him with every step. As he sipped his coffee, his thoughts drifted to Alex, his son, or rather, his wife's son. It was hard to remember exactly when the boy had started becoming so distant, but it was clear now that something had changed. The playful, confident boy he had once known was gone, replaced by someone secretive, almost evasive. With a sigh, the protagonist reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He had spent the better part of the morning trying to avoid the inevitable confrontation, but now he was ready. His fingers tapped out a simple message to his wife. "How's Alex been doing lately? Is everything okay?" The reply came quickly, but it was short and oddly timed. She had been out of the house all day and hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. She reassured him that Alex was fine, but there was something in her response that felt off. It was the kind of answer someone would give if they didn't want to answer, or didn't know how to answer. It left the protagonist with a sense of unease, as though something was being left unsaid. The protagonist tried to shake the feeling. He knew that his wife had her hands full with other matters, and maybe Alex had simply been acting like a typical teenager. Still, something about the message didn't sit right. With a furrowed brow, he began scrolling through Alex's social media profiles. He didn't want to invade his privacy, but the suspicion was too strong to ignore. As he sifted through the posts and messages, his heart sank. There, hidden among the countless interactions, were flirtatious comments exchanged between Alex and a girl he didn't recognize. The messages were playful at first, but as he scrolled further, the tone shifted. The words became more intimate, more suggestive. The protagonist's fingers tightened around his phone as he read on, each new message confirming what he had feared. Alex wasn't just involved with someone behind his back, it was someone his wife had warned him about, someone they had discussed in the past. The protagonist set the phone down slowly, the weight of the discovery settling in his chest. It wasn't just the hidden relationship that bothered him, though. It was the secrecy, the lies that had been building up right under his nose. He had spent months not noticing, not asking questions, but now it all made sense. The way Alex had been avoiding him, the odd behavior, the unexplained absences, all of it pointed back to this one moment. He stared at the phone for a long time, his mind racing with thoughts and emotions. The questions had only multiplied, but the answers remained elusive. What had he missed? What had been going on behind the scenes? And why had Alex felt the need to hide this from him? The house was quiet, but the protagonist's thoughts were anything but. The tension in the air was palpable, and he knew that whatever came next, everything had changed. The day dragged on, each minute stretching out in an uncomfortable silence. The protagonist found himself caught between the quiet of the house and the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. Alex had been more elusive than usual, retreating to his room for hours on end, his footsteps barely audible. It was becoming clear that whatever was going on, Alex was trying to keep it hidden. But the protagonist was no longer content to wait for answers. The time had come to confront the situation head-on. Later that afternoon, the protagonist made his way around the house, hoping to find Alex. He started with the living room, but there was no sign of him. A quick glance out the window revealed that the car was still parked in the driveway, so Alex had to be home. The protagonist's unease deepened. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that Alex was hiding something just beyond his reach. He checked Alex's room once more, only to find it empty. The bed was neatly made, and nothing seemed out of place. It was then that he heard the faintest sound, the click of a door upstairs. He froze, his heart pounding. Someone was in the house, and it wasn't Alex's usual routine to be upstairs at this hour. The protagonist's instincts kicked in, urging him to investigate further. Moving quietly, he ascended the stairs, his every step deliberate and careful. As he reached the landing, he heard muffled voices. He crept closer, listening intently, but not a word was clear. The voices weren't raised, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. He approached the door to the spare room, the source of the voices, and peered through a small gap in the door. What he saw caught him off guard. Alex was there, standing close to a woman the protagonist recognized. The woman wasn't just anyone, it was someone from his past, someone he hadn't thought about in years. His ex-girlfriend. The sight of them together was enough to make the protagonist's blood run cold. They were talking softly, their faces inches apart, their body language far too intimate for comfort. It was clear from their proximity and the way they leaned in toward each other that there was more to their relationship than just casual conversation. The protagonist stood frozen, watching as the woman lightly touched Alex's arm, a gesture that felt far too familiar, too intimate. He felt a surge of anger, confusion, and disbelief all at once. How long had this been going on? How much had been hidden from him? The questions flooded his mind, but the one thing that stood out above all others was the realization that Alex wasn't just hiding a simple relationship. There was something deeper, more dangerous at play. He stepped back quietly, not wanting to alert them to his presence, but his mind was racing. The image of Alex and his ex-girlfriend stayed with him as he retreated down the hallway. The walls of the house seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the weight of the revelation. Everything had changed in that moment. The life he thought he knew, the relationships he thought he understood, all felt like they were slipping away from him. The protagonist returned to the living room, his mind spinning. The shock of what he had just witnessed left him breathless. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew that things would never be the same again. The discovery had shattered everything, and now the only question was how to move forward in the wake of this betrayal. The house felt colder that evening, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of unspoken words. The protagonist sat in the living room, his mind a tangled mess of confusion, anger, and disbelief. He couldn't stop replaying the scene from earlier, Alex and his ex-girlfriend, standing too close, exchanging whispers in the spare room. The image wouldn't leave his mind, burning itself into his thoughts like an indelible mark. He had thought he knew his son, but now, everything seemed like a lie. Alex had been more distant than ever, avoiding eye contact and barely saying a word. The tension between them was suffocating, but there was no avoiding it any longer. The protagonist knew that this confrontation couldn't wait. It had to happen. He needed answers. He couldn't continue living in the same house, pretending that everything was normal when the truth was out there, hanging between them like a dark cloud. He waited for Alex to come downstairs, knowing that the time for silence had passed. His mind was set. The confrontation would be direct, no more evading the issue. The protagonist tried to focus on the mundane, pretending to read through some paperwork, but his thoughts kept wandering back to the discovery. The realization that Alex had been hiding a relationship with his ex, someone the protagonist had once shared intimate moments with, left him feeling betrayed and blindsided. The footsteps finally echoed down the stairs. Alex entered the living room, his usual casual posture replaced by something stiffer, more guarded. He glanced briefly at the protagonist before looking away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The moment stretched on, both of them knowing what was coming but unwilling to speak it out loud. The protagonist felt his pulse quicken. The anger that had been building inside him finally surfaced, but it was tempered by the overwhelming need for answers. The words felt heavy in the air as the protagonist stared at his stepson. Alex shifted nervously, as if sensing the impending storm. He seemed to want to say something but couldn't find the words. The protagonist clenched his jaw, his frustration growing with every second of silence that passed. Finally, he could hold back no longer. He let out a long breath and asked the question that had been burning in his chest. "What's going on, Alex?" The room fell silent once more. Alex looked at the ground, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The protagonist's patience was thinning, but he held his ground, waiting for Alex to answer. The air between them was charged with tension, thick with everything that had been left unsaid. Alex's reluctance to speak only fueled the protagonist's anger. He had given him so many chances, so many moments to come clean, but now, all he could feel was the weight of betrayal. The protagonist stood up from his chair, his movements sharp. He had always tried to be understanding, to offer guidance, but now it seemed like all of that was for nothing. The trust had been shattered beyond repair. Finally, Alex spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. But what he said was enough. The truth came tumbling out. He had been seeing the woman, his father's ex-girlfriend, for months. It hadn't started as anything serious, but it had grown into something more. He didn't know how to explain it, how to justify it. The protagonist felt his stomach turn as Alex admitted the depth of the relationship. The words hung in the air like a punch to the gut. The revelation struck hard, and for a moment, the protagonist was left speechless. His mind was reeling, unable to fully process the weight of the betrayal. His son, his own flesh and blood, had crossed a line he could never uncross. And to make matters worse, it was with someone from his own past, someone he had once trusted. The lines between family and forbidden attraction had blurred beyond recognition, and everything that had once seemed solid now felt fragile and broken. The room grew colder, the silence pressing in like a physical force. The protagonist's anger swelled, but there was also a deep sense of helplessness. How could he have let this happen? How had he missed all the signs? His mind raced with 1,000 questions, none of which had simple answers. The truth, now laid bare, was impossible to ignore. The trust between them had been shattered, and there was no going back. Alex stood in front of him, eyes downcast, waiting for some kind of reaction. The protagonist felt his emotions surge, anger, disappointment, frustration, but at the same time, there was an undeniable sense of loss. The boy he had tried so hard to raise, the son he had welcomed into his home, had betrayed him in a way that felt both personal and devastating. There was no turning back from this. The protagonist knew this confrontation had been inevitable, but the fallout was harder than he could have imagined. Everything had changed in an instant, and now all that remained was the cold, hard truth. The damage had been done. The evening arrived, bringing with it a stillness that seemed to settle into every corner of the house. The protagonist could feel the weight of the day pressing down on him, but he knew that dinner would be an unavoidable routine, one he couldn't escape. It was the same every night. Everyone gathered around the table, making small talk over the clink of utensils and the shuffle of plates. But tonight it was different. The air between them was heavy, suffocating almost, as if the walls themselves knew what had transpired earlier. Alex, who had been unusually quiet since their confrontation, sat across from the protagonist, his eyes glued to his plate. He barely glanced up, his movements slow and deliberate. The usual sense of casual ease that filled their family dinners was gone. Instead, there was a palpable distance between them, an unspoken tension that neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge, but both were acutely aware of. The protagonist kept his eyes on Alex, watching his every move, but the boy seemed to shrink further into himself with each passing moment. The protagonist's mind kept drifting back to the conversation they'd had earlier, the weight of Alex's confession still fresh in his mind. He could hear the words echoing in his head, "I've been seeing her." The simple declaration had shattered the illusion of the family dynamic they'd all shared, and now, even something as mundane as dinner felt strained, artificial. The protagonist could feel the flickers of anger rising in him again, but he forced himself to swallow it. He had tried to keep calm earlier, but now, as he sat across from Alex, the anger simmered just beneath the surface. As the protagonist glanced at his wife, he noticed that she too seemed distracted, her eyes focused on her meal rather than her family. She hadn't said much since their conversation, and the absence of her usual warmth only added to the feeling of isolation that had settled over the house. The protagonist found himself wondering how much she really knew, how much she had been hiding. She had always seemed so trusting, so accepting of Alex, but now doubt crept in. Had she seen the signs? Had she known something wasn't right, or had everything truly been kept from her too? The clatter of silverware against plates filled the uncomfortable silence, but the protagonist couldn't seem to focus on the food. Every bite felt like it stuck in his throat, his appetite gone. He pushed his food around the plate absently, trying to appear normal, but the facade was slipping. How long could they keep pretending everything was fine? How long could they keep up this charade when the truth was already out, hanging in the air like a storm ready to break? Alex's phone buzzed on the table, its vibrations cutting through the silence. The boy reached for it quickly, his hand trembling slightly as he glanced at the screen. The protagonist caught a glimpse of the name that flashed across the display, and his stomach tightened. It was the same woman, the one he had seen Alex with earlier. His pulse quickened, and the feeling of betrayal surged again, but he held himself in check. There was no use in making a scene now. Not in front of his wife. Not at the dinner table. The room seemed to shrink around them, the space between the protagonist and Alex growing wider with each passing second. The tension was almost unbearable, and neither of them seemed willing to break the silence. Even when Alex stood up abruptly, excusing himself from the table without a word, the protagonist stayed seated, his mind racing. There was nothing left to say. Not yet. The conversation they needed to have could wait. But the damage had already been done. Dinner had been nothing more than a reminder of how broken things had become. The walls of the house, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a cage, closing in on them all. As Alex retreated to his room, the protagonist felt the weight of the moment. The house felt quieter than before, and the distance between them felt wider. He glanced at his wife, who had not moved since Alex's abrupt departure. Her expression was unreadable, and for a brief moment, the protagonist wondered if she too was wondering how they had arrived at this point. But instead of voicing her thoughts, she simply continued eating, her movements slow and deliberate. It was as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. The night wore on in uncomfortable silence, and as the protagonist eventually excused himself from the table, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of emptiness. They had all fallen into their own worlds, their own versions of reality, but the one they had once shared was gone. What remained now was a broken family, standing on the edge of something they could neither understand nor repair. The days seemed to drag on, each one blending into the next as the tension in the house simmered beneath the surface. The protagonist couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something had been irreparably damaged, something that could never be fixed. It wasn't just the relationship between him and Alex, it was everything. The house no longer felt like home. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the protagonist couldn't find a way to breathe easily again. Alex's behavior had become even more distant since the confrontation. He barely spoke, and when he did, his words were short, almost clipped. It was as if the walls had gone up, creating an invisible barrier between them that the protagonist couldn't breach. Every time they crossed paths, Alex would either avoid eye contact or offer an excuse to leave the room. It was clear that the boy didn't want to engage. But the protagonist couldn't ignore the growing tension. He couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine. He had to know the truth, the full extent of what was happening and why it was happening. One afternoon, the protagonist found himself sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall. The silence was deafening. His thoughts drifted back to the first time he had met Alex, the hopeful way the boy had looked at him, eager for a relationship with the man who was now his stepfather. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago, swallowed up by the secrets that had been uncovered. But what stung the most was the betrayal, not just of the family's trust, but of everything he had tried to build with Alex. They had been through so much together, or so he thought. Now, the foundation they had built seemed to crumble under the weight of hidden truths. The protagonist knew he couldn't go on like this. He couldn't keep dancing around the issue. It was time to face it head-on, no more avoiding the truth. He stood up, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and nervous anticipation. He knew what he had to do. Later that evening, after dinner, the protagonist found Alex alone in the living room. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach him. The boy had been so closed off lately, so guarded. But this needed to be done. No more games, no more silence. The protagonist walked into the room, his resolve firm. He looked at Alex, who was slouched on the couch, his eyes trained on his phone. The protagonist didn't waste any time. He asked the question directly, cutting through the stillness of the room. "Are you seeing someone behind my back?" Alex flinched, his head jerking up to meet the protagonist's gaze. There was a flash of something guilt, perhaps, or fear before Alex quickly looked away. He didn't say anything for a long time, his lips pressed tightly together, his fingers fidgeting with the phone in his hands. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to slice through with a knife. Finally, Alex spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He admitted the truth, confirming what the protagonist had already suspected. "It wasn't just a fling," he said, "but something more serious." The protagonist could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air, each one like a blow to the chest. His ex-girlfriend. The woman who had once been a part of his life, someone he thought he had moved on from. And now Alex had gotten involved with her behind his back. The confession left the protagonist feeling hollow. The anger that had been building up inside him was still there, but it was overshadowed by a crushing sense of disappointment. He had always tried to be patient with Alex, to be understanding, but this was beyond what he could comprehend. He had never expected something like this from his son, or from anyone in his family. It felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any other. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The room was heavy with the weight of the revelation, and the protagonist couldn't shake the sense that everything had changed in that instant. The trust they had once shared had been shattered, and there was no way to rebuild it. The cracks that had formed in their relationship were now wide open, and no amount of apologies or explanations could close them. Alex shifted uncomfortably on the couch, his eyes not meeting the protagonist's. He seemed ashamed, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase the damage that had already been done. The protagonist stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The words he had wanted to say, the ones that had been brewing inside him for days, caught in his throat. Anger, disappointment, confusion. All of it surged to the surface, but he didn't let it out. He simply turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy as he left Alex sitting there alone. The protagonist knew that this confrontation had been necessary, but it didn't feel like a victory. There were no winners in the situation, no happy endings. Only the cold, hard reality of what had been uncovered. And as the protagonist made his way to his room, the weight of it all pressed down on him. Trust had been broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The following days passed in a blur of quiet tension. The protagonist could sense that something had shifted between him and Alex, an irreparable divide that neither of them knew how to bridge. The conversations had dwindled to almost nothing, the interactions awkward and strained. Every time they crossed paths, the protagonist felt the weight of their last confrontation pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the image of Alex, sitting there on the couch, admitting to a betrayal that felt too deep to forgive. The truth had come out, but it hadn't brought any sense of relief, only more confusion, more hurt. The protagonist found himself spending more time alone, retreating to his office or his room whenever he could. He couldn't bear the quiet meals, the forced small talk, the way everything felt hollow now. It was as if the very fabric of the household had unraveled, leaving behind only the remnants of what used to be. He thought back to when he and his wife had first built this life together, how everything had seemed perfect at the time. And now it felt as though all of it had been built on a foundation of lies. One evening, after a long, solitary day, the protagonist decided he could no longer stay silent. He needed to confront his wife. The way she had been avoiding the subject only made things worse. She had barely spoken a word since Alex's confession, and the few conversations they had had were filled with tension, as if neither of them knew how to address what was happening. The protagonist had tried to give her space, to let her handle it in her own way, but the silence between them was growing unbearable. He found her in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove, her back turned to him. She didn't seem to notice him standing there, lost in her own thoughts. The protagonist watched her for a moment, studying her movements, the way she carried herself. She had always been so calm, so composed, but now there was a weariness to her that he hadn't seen before. It was clear that the situation was taking its toll on her as well, but she hadn't said anything. He cleared his throat, and she glanced up, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of something, uncertainty, perhaps, or guilt. The tension between them hung heavy in the air as he took a step closer. There was no easy way to start this conversation. He had been avoiding it for days, unsure of how to approach her, but now he couldn't put it off any longer. The question that had been swirling in his mind for days finally came out. Did you know about Alex and her? The question lingered in the air, thick with meaning. His wife didn't immediately respond. Instead, she set the spoon down on the counter and took a deep breath as if gathering her thoughts. The protagonist could see the conflict in her eyes. She had known, and yet she hadn't said anything. Her silence spoke volumes, but still, he waited, hoping for an answer that would make sense of everything. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost defeated. She admitted that she had suspected something, but she had never imagined it would go as far as it had. The woman, the ex-girlfriend, had been in their lives before, and though his wife had never been fond of her, she never thought Alex would get involved with her. She hadn't seen it coming, just as the protagonist hadn't. The protagonist felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, but above all, he felt the sting of betrayal. Not just from Alex, but from the woman he had trusted, the one person who should have been on his side. The silence between them stretched on, thick with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. His wife explained that she hadn't known how to bring it up, how to tell him what she had suspected. She hadn't wanted to add to the strain that already existed between them. But now, with everything out in the open, there was no turning back. The trust they had once shared had been broken, and there was no easy way to rebuild it. The damage had been done, and no amount of explanations or apologies could change that. The protagonist listened, his mind racing with everything she said. He wanted to feel angry, wanted to lash out at her for keeping this from him, but he couldn't. The truth was, he didn't know what to feel anymore. The foundation of his marriage had been shaken, just as his relationship with Alex had been. The cracks were too deep, and nothing seemed to be able to fix them. He was left standing in the midst of the wreckage, unsure of what to do next. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, and he could only stand there, trying to process the unraveling of everything he thought he knew. The days following the conversation with his wife were clouded with confusion and bitterness. The protagonist could feel the growing distance between him and everyone in the house. He was becoming a ghost in his own home, wandering from room to room, trying to ignore the tension that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Alex remained distant, his behavior unchanged, but now the protagonist could see the undercurrent of defiance in his eyes, as if challenging him at every turn. One evening, when his wife was out, the protagonist found himself alone with Alex in the living room. The house felt eerily quiet, the soft ticking of the clock the only sound in the room. Alex sat on the couch, eyes focused on his phone, avoiding any direct interaction. But the protagonist couldn't let this moment slip by without confronting the boy again. There was no longer any excuse for avoiding the truth, no longer any reason to let the game continue. The revelation had already cracked their world apart, but now the protagonist was starting to see something more dangerous. Alex wasn't just hiding his relationship with the woman. He was manipulating the situation, playing his part in a way that made everything even more twisted than it had seemed before. The protagonist could feel the shift in the air as he sat across from Alex. The power dynamic that once existed between them, father and son, had shifted, and it was now a game of control. Alex had started playing with fire, pushing boundaries and testing limits. The boy no longer seemed like the vulnerable teen he had once been. He was taking control, turning the tables and forcing the protagonist into a position where he had no choice but to respond. It was like a chess match, and Alex was making his move. As the evening wore on, the protagonist felt the tension mount. It wasn't just the betrayal anymore. It was the growing realization that Alex was no longer trying to hide his actions. He was daring the protagonist to stop him, daring him to do something about it. But the protagonist was stuck. He wasn't sure how to react, what to do next. There was anger, yes, but also a strange sense of powerlessness. It was as if Alex had already won, and the protagonist was left holding the broken pieces of what had once been a family. The silence between them felt heavy, almost oppressive. The protagonist couldn't keep his eyes off of Alex, watching him, analyzing every little movement, every shift in his posture. Alex finally broke the silence, but his words were more of a challenge than an explanation. There was no remorse, no apology, just cold indifference. It was clear that the boy had no intention of backing down. As the night dragged on, the protagonist felt the weight of his own helplessness. The confrontation had spiraled into something darker, something more complex than he had expected. There was no resolution, no clarity. Just more confusion, more unanswered questions. It felt like the protagonist was being pulled into a dangerous game, one that he had never asked to play. He didn't know how to stop it, or even if he could. But what troubled him the most was the sense of manipulation that Alex had begun to wield. The boy was no longer the confused teenager he had once been. Now, he was someone who understood the power he held, and he was using it to manipulate the protagonist, turning everything into a twisted game of dominance. The protagonist was forced to wonder how far Alex would push, how far he could go before the game became too dangerous to control. The protagonist stood up, his body tense with frustration. There was no way to undo what had been done, no way to erase the betrayal. But the realization hit him, he was no longer in control of the situation. The rules had changed, and it was no longer just about trust or family. Now it was about power, and Alex was the one who held the cards. The protagonist didn't know where this game would end, but he knew one thing for sure: it was no longer about what was right or wrong. It was about survival. And Alex was going to push him to the edge to see just how far he would go. The days blurred together as the tension between the protagonist and Alex reached a boiling point. The atmosphere in the house had become increasingly hostile, as though every inch of the walls was soaked with the weight of all the unspoken truths and betrayals. The protagonist no longer knew how to navigate the house. Each room felt like a battleground, each interaction with Alex a dangerous game that neither of them had agreed to play. The air felt thick with the aftermath of every confrontation, every look, every moment where the truth was forced into the open. The protagonist knew that the time had come for one final reckoning. The pieces of the puzzle had been scattered for too long, and the constant shifting, the silent games Alex was playing, had gone on long enough. There was no more room for doubt. The protagonist had to face what was happening, had to face the son he thought he knew, but who had become a stranger in his eyes. He couldn't keep pretending that nothing was wrong. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship was now a distant memory, replaced by a growing sense of betrayal that couldn't be ignored. One evening, after a long, silent day, the protagonist found himself standing at the edge of a precipice. He had tried to avoid the inevitable, but it was impossible now. He knew Alex was up in his room, the door locked, his presence felt like a ghost in the house. It wasn't just the revelation about the ex-girlfriend anymore, it was everything that had come after. The manipulation, the power dynamics, the coldness that Alex had adopted, like he was playing a game where the stakes were higher than either of them could afford to lose. The protagonist made his way up the stairs, his footsteps steady but heavy. As he reached Alex's door, he paused, taking a deep breath before knocking. There was no answer, but he could hear movement on the other side. It wasn't the hesitation that had been there before, the reluctance to face what had been exposed. It was something different now, almost defiant, like Alex knew this confrontation had been coming, and now he was ready for it. But the protagonist wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to accept the reality that had unfolded in front of him. He opened the door without waiting for permission, stepping into the room. Alex was sitting at his desk, his back to the door, his focus on something the protagonist couldn't see. The air between them crackled with the tension of everything that had been left unsaid. The protagonist stood there for a long moment, watching his son, trying to find the words that had eluded him for days. But the truth was clear. Everything had led to this point, and there was no turning back. Without speaking, the protagonist crossed the room and stood in front of Alex. The boy didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence. It was as if they were already strangers, as if the bond between them had been severed beyond repair. The protagonist's heart ached, but there was no room for softness now. The silence stretched between them, a chasm that couldn't be crossed with words alone. The revelation, the final truth, had already been exposed. There was nothing more to uncover, nothing more to hide. Alex finally turned, his eyes cold, as if nothing had changed. The protagonist saw no regret, no remorse in those eyes. Just a strange, quiet defiance, as if he had already accepted that things could never go back to the way they were. And in that moment, the protagonist realized that Alex was no longer the boy he had raised. He had become something else, someone who could manipulate, who could lie without hesitation, who could hurt without looking back. The boy had grown into a man, but it wasn't a version of him the protagonist had ever expected. The final revelation wasn't in the words exchanged between them. It wasn't in any explanation or apology. It was in the silence, the cold, unyielding silence that filled the room as the protagonist looked at his son. The trust had been shattered, and it could never be rebuilt. There was nothing left to say. The family they had once been had been torn apart, piece by piece, and now all that remained was the broken remnants of what could never be repaired. The protagonist turned and walked out of the room, the door closing softly behind him. As he descended the stairs, he felt the weight of everything that had happened crash down on him. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, they all mixed together, swirling in a storm of emotions that left him numb. He didn't know what the future held, or if there was even a place for him in the house anymore. But one thing was clear, the boy he had known was gone, and there was no bringing him back. The game was over, and all that remained was the aftermath. The house had never felt so empty. The protagonist wandered through the rooms, his footsteps echoing against the cold walls, but the silence was deafening. Everything had changed in an instant, and yet the passage of time had become almost irrelevant. The family he had known, the relationships he had worked so hard to build, had all slipped away, leaving nothing but hollow remnants. The house had become a shell, a reminder of the trust that had once existed but now lay shattered in pieces. Days passed without much change. The protagonist moved through the motions, his routine unchanged, but his mind distant. He had no real direction, no purpose. Every action, every thought, seemed colored by the realization that everything he had worked for was gone. Alex remained locked in his room, barely emerging, and when he did, it was with a cold, distant gaze. The boy had retreated entirely, and the protagonist couldn't help but wonder if it was for the best. There was nothing left to say to him, no reconciliation to be made. Even his wife, who had once been his confidant, seemed to be drifting further away. Her silence had become just as heavy as his own. They coexisted under the same roof, sharing meals in strained quiet, exchanging only the most necessary words. The intimacy that had once defined their marriage had all but evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable distance neither of them knew how to bridge. They were no longer a team, no longer partners in anything. They were simply two people trapped in the aftermath of something they couldn't undo. The protagonist found himself sitting in his office one afternoon, staring at the paperwork on his desk, but the words were nothing more than a blur. He couldn't focus. His mind kept returning to the same thoughts: Alex, the betrayal, the broken trust. It was as if he couldn't escape the constant nagging feeling that nothing would ever be the same. He didn't know how to fix it, didn't know if it could even be fixed. The weight of it all was suffocating, and yet he was powerless to change anything. There was a strange sense of finality to it all. The damage had been done, and now they were all left to pick up the pieces. But some pieces were too small, too shattered to be put back together. The protagonist knew this, and it was a hard truth to swallow. He had tried. He had tried to keep the family together, to hold on to what they had, but it had slipped through his fingers. And now, all that was left was the fallout, the quiet emptiness that lingered in every room. One evening, as the protagonist sat alone in the living room, the doorbell rang. He didn't expect anyone, and the sound of it echoed through the house, sharp and jarring. He rose from his chair, his movements slow and mechanical, as if each step took more effort than the last. When he opened the door, he found no one there, only a small package sitting on the doorstep. He bent down to pick it up, feeling a pang of confusion as he examined the unfamiliar parcel. There was no return address, no message attached. Just a plain, wrapped box. He stared at it for a long moment, unsure of what to do. But then, something inside him made him tear open the packaging. Inside, there was a letter, folded neatly. He unfolded it, his hands trembling slightly as he read the words scrawled on the page. It was short, simple, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. The letter was from Alex. The words were hesitant, but clear. "I'm sorry." That was all it said. The protagonist stood there in the doorway, the letter in his hands, feeling the weight of the apology that had never been spoken aloud. It was as though the letter carried all the things Alex could never say to his face. The anger, the betrayal, the confusion, all of it, wrapped up in those two simple words. "I'm sorry." It wasn't enough to erase the damage, but it was something. The protagonist folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope. He didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know what it meant. But for the first time in what felt like forever, a small piece of him softened. There was no resolution in sight, no happy ending, but perhaps there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe that was all that was left, hope for something better, for a future that wasn't defined by the mistakes of the past. He closed the door quietly behind him and returned to his seat. The silence in the house was no less oppressive, but for the first time, the protagonist didn't feel completely alone. Perhaps, in time, things could begin to heal. Maybe not for him, but for Alex, for the pieces of a broken family that still remained. But that was a thought for another day. For now, he sat in the stillness, contemplating what had been lost and what, if anything, could ever be found again.